We got lunch in the small town while Nick was off seeing if there were any remaining bodies he could collect to be sent for testing. He caught up to us when he finished. Chaz and Rebecca left to buy more supplies and cream for her spider bite, leaving Nick and I to talk about the case. As far as I can tell, the lights and circle could be made by humans, but the deceased cows could not. Supernatural creatures could be the cause of the lights and the cows, but not the circle. Nick started, his arms crossed. He appeared slightly frustrated, as if he was missing something right in front of his face. Aliens could be the cause of all three, I offered. He looked down at me, dressed in an Area 51 shirt. I looked like I should be a part of those alien conspiracy documentaries who took the idea far too seriously. We've only been with Rebecca and Chaz for a day, and I already turned over to their side in a way. I suppose, he said after some hesitation. He did not want to mock his partner's new interests. Why was he so against the idea of it? He hadn't dismissed it outright, but it was never his first option. Wasn't the sister corporation made just to deal with cases like this? If aliens weren't real, then why bother? When the other two joined us, Nick didn't add much to our conversations. The rest of the day we went over what data Rebecca and Chaz collected while they went over the crop circle again. Around dinner time they came back and Nick suggested we all investigate the woods that night together. He wanted to look over the clearing and shack we found before. We didn't see anything, but he suggested that those two might pick something up with the equipment they brought along. The pair appeared excited to finally be taken seriously by someone wearing a suit. They found it difficult to narrow down what bulky machines they wanted to take. It was all heavy and was unable to decide on what to leave behind until Nick showed he could carry most of it. Neither questioned how someone of his smaller frame was so strong. He hadn't eaten in front of them, or slept at all. Both were missing some signs that Nick was not normal. Thankfully, Chaz and Rebecca brought along lanterns so we could see in the dark clearing when we arrived. It was extremely creepy. With my past history of the woods, I was feeling uncomfortable being out there at night. I wished I brought my gun along. When I started to put the holster on over top of my baggy borrowed clothing, I noticed how stressed Chaz and Rebecca were at the sight of it. They wouldn't say it, but the pair didn't like being around guns. For their sake, I left it behind, locking at the car trunk. Nick still had a sword, so we weren't going in the woods completely defenseless. As I was helping Chaz plug in some machines to a generator, he whispered over to me that Rebecca watched her father be shot while trying to stop a robbery when she was younger. He lived, but the event really put her off from being around guns. She would never ask me to leave it behind, but was extremely thankful I did. So far, there hadn't been any signs of any real danger. I wondered if the outcome would have been any different if I did bring it along that night. After everything was set up, I became a little bit useless. Those two could look over readings and fiddle with machines while Nick could keep an eye out in the forest for anything lurking in the dark. Somehow, I was the person who first noticed something was strange. Looking up at the night sky, I didn't see the stars like last night. At first, I assumed it was simply too cloudy to see. But if that was the case, wouldn't the clouds be some sort of color aside from pitch black? My attention was drawn away when I heard a sound. To my horror, Nick suddenly collapsed where he stood. I shouted his name and it got Rebecca's and Chaz's attention. I ran towards him to see what was wrong. A few steps in, a blinding light overtook the entire clearing. It was so bright I couldn't see anything for a few moments. My body felt light and I no longer could feel the ground under my feet. A screaming came to my left. My eyes adjusted in time for me to see Rebecca floating off the ground, flailing and screaming her head off. I kicked, trying to remain on the ground. The three of us were slowly floating upwards, unable to stop. Nick was barely awake and on his feet. He was the only one still on the ground. Knowing he wouldn't reach me in time, he tossed the orchestra in my direction. My fingers wrapped around the scabbard just as he collapsed back to the ground again and the light overtook my vision. When I woke up, everything was so bright it took me a while to see where I was. The orchestra still in my hands. I quickly put the scabbard through a belt loop not to lose it. The room was so small I could barely stand up. It was so wide it gave me a headache and made it hard to see where the walls were. Placing a hand on the first wall I found, I used it to guide myself to an opening I couldn't see until my eyes adjusted to it. The oval opening was covered in some sort of invisible wall. On the other side was Rebecca, a few feet away in her own room, sobbing. She put all this effort into finding aliens, and when she finally did, she couldn't handle it. I pounded on the hard wall trying to get her attention. She finally saw me and pressed her hands against her own wall, still crying. I needed to get us out of here. Pulling at the orchestra, it remained inside its scabbard. The sword was still upset with me and refused to be used. Looking down, I needed to beg the sword to help us get free before whatever took us came for their victims. I've only known Rebecca and Chaz for a short while, but I refused to let anything happen to them. The sword shook slightly inside the black scabbard, showing it was still upset, but I could draw it. A pleasant ring came as I pulled the sword free. With a swung, I aimed it at the invisible wall, praying the blast that would come from the sword wasn't too powerful and harmed Rebecca. The shockwave that came smashed through what was holding me prisoner, but didn't do much more damage aside from that. The sword wasn't lending me its full power. I can't believe it was still holding a grudge over me, confusing a few words. How petty could something be? I ran over to Rebecca, gesturing for her to stand back so I could smash through her all as well. She looked confused over where I even got a sword, but clued into what I wanted. With another swung, she was free and clinging to me. Sobbing, I was freaked out. If I was alone and nothing to focus on, I might be acting the same way she was. The place had an uneven white floor. It smelled almost like a chemical I couldn't place. We found Chaz nearby in his own room, looking confused and scared. Thankfully not a sobbing mess like Rebecca, with the two of them on either side. We slowly started to make our way through the new place. We're going to die. No one is going to know what happened to us. They're going to take us into space and we're never going to get back home. Rebecca choked out. I didn't want to think we were abducted in a spaceship. But where else were we? My stress levels were through the roof and I was so scared my hand holding the sword trembled. Suddenly Rebecca pulled away, bumping into the rough white surface of the narrow hallway. Why do you have a space sword? Are you an alien? Did you trick us this entire time? She accused, fingers shaking towards me. Chaz stayed silent, his large eyes wide in fear. He looked over at me, not buying what his friend was saying, but simply scared over the situation we were in. I'm not an alien. The sword isn't from space. I couldn't bring myself to tell her it was magic. In my hand, the sword shook in its own way, telling me to ditch her. I was appalled by the mental suggestion it just gave me. I didn't know where we were, or what kind of dangers we faced and needed to protect them. She was making it really hard for our only weapon to like her enough to do so, as she kept throwing out more accusations. I tried my best to calm her down. Chaz couldn't get any words into our conversation. When he started to tug at my sleeve, I ignored him until he nearly tugged me off my feet, following where he was pointing. I saw an opening appeared a few feet front us. Standing there watching us as a small gray creature, one with massive black eyes and a large head. We all fell into silence as we all stared at the motionless thing looking right back at us. At first, I didn't think it was real, but rather some sort of prop. How could it be real? This thing looked identical to the gray alien Chaz had on his shirt. The sudden appearance of the creature nearly made me faint in fear after I got over my shock of seeing it. Rebecca let out a loud scream that made us all jump. She ran over to wrap her arms around my chest so tightly I couldn't breathe. Chaz joined her and I had a pair of them screaming and crushing the air from my lungs. Even the small alien creature appeared startled from their reactions. Something else happened I never would have expected. The orchestra took over my arm to force it to attack the creature in front of us. The sword was freaking out like the rest of them. A terrible crashing sound came from the shockwaves, not like the beautiful sounds the sword normally made in a fight. Within seconds, the hallway in front of us was shredded along with the creature that exploded in a burst of what looked to be cotton. It was hard to tell with everything that was going on, as the sword still attacked. The spaceship, or whatever else we were in, started to come apart. Massive cracks appeared as it broke. The brightness snapped off as if someone turned off a light. I tried holding onto the still screaming pair as the floor fell out front under our feet. We were falling between clumps of debris that didn't look like the ship we were on moments before. I nearly lost Chaz in the fall. A cold wind blew at us as we quickly got closer to the trees. If we didn't do something, we would be dead. I couldn't use the sword because it was still freaking out and refused to let any of its power to be accessed. We were going to die and I didn't understand the reason. Just before we hit the trees, my vision was overtaken by hundreds of flapping black wings. Countless cries of crows drowned out the screaming and the wind rushing past our faces. When the crows flew off, we found ourselves sitting in a clearing covering in feathers but somehow alive. Chaz was too stunned to speak. I replaced the sword into its scabbard and tried my best to get Rebecca calmed down. She no longer had any tears, but was having such a bad panic attack I thought she was dying. It felt like years before she calmed down enough to leave her alone for a minute. Around us was hunks of something I couldn't place. Walking over, I took a piece in my hand to look over. It took a while bit to realize it was a torn piece of papier mâché painted white. None of this made any sense. We all jumped when someone came stumbling through the bushes. Nick. I rushed over, glad to see him. I handed over his sword but didn't know where to start. Instead of telling him what happened, he wanted to check on the two first. They were still understandably freaked out. Just ask. I started to ask some questions. A cackling laughter rang through the woods. It sounded so much like a crow I thought it belonged to the birds that saved us. Out from the woods came a strange creature the laughter belonged to. It wasn't tall, maybe only 4 feet, but it still freaked out Rebecca enough to make her clung to Nick, who didn't know how to handle someone hanging off of him. The creature had long black hair covering its dark face. Bird feet floated off the ground and a pair of black feathered wings was tucked tightly against the small body. It was dressed in black, still cackling away at our faces. You should have seen your reactions. I was worth all the effort. I cackled, unable to stop. I stood completely dumbfounded. What was this thing talking about? Didn't we see an alien? Weren't we on a ship? It answered my questions when it put a part of a shredded latex alien face we'd seen before. All of us but Nick was completely confused on what was going on. This is Loki. He's named that because he's always playing pranks like this, Nick said, as if that explained everything. Prank? Rebecca screamed in a shrill voice. We were on a spaceship. It was papier mache. I used a bunch of patchwork spells on to make it look like a spaceship. I've always wanted to pull an alien prank, and when you all showed up, I just couldn't help it. I even got one of these stuffed alien guys and put a spell on it to make it walk around and freak you out. It was hilarious. More cackling laughter came. I still couldn't believe this. He scared us all to death, all for a laugh. I stomped over to the creature, ready to lay into him. When he looked up at me with big dark eyes under his hair, I nearly stopped. This creature was so childlike he might not understand how wrong what he did really was. You need to say sorry to those two. You could have scared Rebecca to death. And Chaz can't talk yet. I understand wanting to have fun, but this went too far. I scolded him, looking from between me and the other pair. The amused look on his face faded. His expression turned into worry, as if he just realized what he just did. They weren't really that scared, right? I mean, it was just a joke after all. Loki defended himself in a small voice. Just a joke. You destroyed a farmer's income with that crop circle and all those cows you killed for a little joke. None of this was funny at all. I said, arms crossed, sounding like I was scolding a child for drawing on the walls. I watched as Loki looked between me and the other three. For a long while he didn't answer. His face twisted in confusion. What cows? I like cows. I would never hurt them for a joke. I may have done the circle, but I would have used a spell to make the corn grow extra well next year to make up for it. But killing cows is something I would never do. The tone made me want to believe him. He could still be messing with us after all, trying to escape some blame. I glanced over to Nick, and his slightly worried expression was all I needed to know. Loki was telling the truth about not harming the cows. He may have made a false spaceship to freak out 3 humans. But something else was going on, just as I was about to ask. A blaring sound came from the woods. It was so loud I thought my eardrums would burst. My chest hurt from the intensity of the trumpet-like noise. Loki leapt into my arms, scared to death, making it clear he was not behind whatever was making the noise. Nick scooped up both Rebecca and Chaz so we could take off running. There was no way we were going to stay inside those woods after hearing something like that. I followed behind Nick, frantically running to leave the sound behind. A bright light flickered through the trees as if it was searching for something. Nick wanted to get the group somewhere safe before he made a stand against whatever threat showed itself. By some miracle, we were near the edge of the woods the moment we left the trees. The noise and light stopped. My body and mind were worn out from everything that happened that night. Nick wanted to go back in and deal with whatever was in the woods, but the pair had clung onto him. He would end up hurting them trying to get them off. Until they calmed down, he was awkwardly stuck holding the pair. Honestly, I didn't want him going back into the woods. Even Loki was freaking out, the small creature in my arms promising he had nothing to do with what we ran from. We waited for a few minutes, and to my surprise, cars started to race down the road we found ourselves on, lights flashing. At least 10 SUVs stopped in front of our group, and men dressed in suits came spilling out. They looked more official than Nick did. These guys were real government agent types, shouting orders and making the entire scene so overwhelming. They threatened to arrest us until Nick got his badge out with some difficulty. None of the new agents appeared pleased by us. They shoved us into a car and were driven back to the farmhouse with orders to leave in the morning. Some promises of what to happen to us if we weren't cleared out by then given out before the agent took off down the dirt road back towards the rest of the activity. We were left out front of the house, in shock from the night. Nicky, what the hell just happened? I asked. Aliens, he offered after a long pause. Whatever it was, we got kicked off the case. We closed the supernatural part of what was happening. Loki was so freaked out he promised to never pull a prank like this again. He even said sorry to Rebecca and Chaz after we got inside. He honestly didn't think it would have upset them so badly. He assumed them being a part of the corporation meant they deal with supernatural things before and could get over it. Neither could take their eyes off him. After all, he was the first creature they'd ever seen. I was exhausted and fell asleep on the couch for a few hours until we needed to get packed up to leave. In those few hours, Rebecca and Loki became somewhat friendly with each other. I woke up to him sitting in her lap telling her what worldly mysteries he was positive had a supernatural cause. Nick was packing away their equipment for them. I got dressed in my old clothing and needed to find Chaz to return his. I found him outside in the backyard talking on a phone. As I got closer, I could hear he wasn't speaking in a language I knew, but rather something with a lot of clicks and strange noises. He froze, sensing someone behind him. He quickly hung up, shoving his phone away in his pocket. It looked to have a weird case on it with some blinking lights. His face pale with fear, he waited for me to comment on whatever I walked in on. "Here's your clothes," I said, trying to hand them to him. He took the pants but let me keep the t-shirt, saying it would make good sleeping shirt. I kept it and wisely decided not to bring up how strangely he was acting. If he secretly wasn't human working for the sister corporation, it was none of my business to know, and I didn't know how much more I could take right then. When everything was packed up, we exchanged numbers. I might have been scared to death but ended up with some new friends. I wondered if Rebecca was going to stick looking for aliens or if she would switch to supernatural creatures. Loki stuck with them, promising to behave at least for a little while. As we drove back, I watched the tall cornfields fly by. We were leaving the case with more questions than answers. It wasn't often our jobs felt so incomplete. Let's never do an alien case if we can help it. I don't think I'll sleep for a week after this. Nick agreed with my statement. After I was dropped off back at home, I had a few smaller jobs to work on. I would be far too busy to think about how open-ended we left this case for a while, and far too busy to watch any alien movies.